Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. We're going to get started. I have a couple announcements first. This event we are doing in conjunction with the Political Student Assembly, and I thank them. Tomorrow night, our Tuesday night program at Ground Zero will focus on America's shrinking middle class. We're having a conference, an all-day conference on the new electorate on September 28th to talk about age, gender gaps, racial divides, millennial voters. It will be from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Here in the campus center, and you can RSVP on Eventbrite. This, my friend David Cain, this is his new book, which I will not agree with, called Shall Not Be Infringed, The New Assaults on Your Second Amendment. You can buy it at davidcain.com, or you can get it on Amazon.
I always test myself, because if Bob were to agree with me, then I'd know I was saying the wrong thing.
But we do sort of remember a time in Washington when people who disagreed across a whole wide range of issues could actually be civil to each other, could get along, and could have a real conversation. And that's what we're going to try to do today. And it's not my function here to be argumentative. It's my function here to ask questions and hope that we learn something.
You can be forgiven if you can't help it.
Before we get to first of all, David Cain, you all know from the publicity, is the former president of the NRA, former head of the American Conservative Union, editor-at-large of the Washington Times. I think I've known you for 38 years or something like that. And I want to start, before we get to the NRA, before we get to Donald Trump, I'd like to ask you about the Reagan years, when you did become chairman of the American Conservative Union. Reagan is the conservative icon, yet he made a deal with Tip O'Neill to save Social Security. He made a deal with Ted Kennedy on immigration reform that included a path to citizenship. How would that go over in today's Republican Party?
Well, interestingly, they did a poll, and there was a major article about President Trump and his immigration deal with the Democrats, where they interviewed his people, and most of them think that on the DREAM Act that he was right to cancel it because it was done wrong, but that they would support legislation to fix it. So, you know, it's hard to put people into hard and fast categories. Ronald Reagan was always of the view that in the political world you get most or some of what you want, and you deal with other people, because that's the reality of the world. You know, when I talk to young conservatives, for example, I say, you know, if you're an ideological conservative, and this would be true of liberals as well, you have your foot in two camps if you're involved in politics. On the one hand, you talk, when I'm talking to conservatives, I say you describe that city on the hill that Reagan dreamed of. On the other hand, in the political world, you know that you can't snap your fingers and achieve all your goals and change the world. So what you ask of people that you support politically, or of yourself if you're in a political job, is, are you putting a brick in place where you can build that at some point? Because the political world is a world in which you have to work with other people if you're going to succeed. And when I say other people, I don't mean just liberals and Democrats. Conservatives don't agree on much of anything. We've been, as I've described it years ago, we're a fractious movement. When there were 7 of us, we had 3 different schools of thought, and we argued with each other. But when we came up against guys like Shrum, then we were all together.
But do you hold out much hope in Washington for the kind of politics that Reagan, Kennedy, Tip O'Neill, people like that, Bob Michael represented?
Not right now, and there are a number of reasons for that. One, the parties have changed. When I worked on the Hill, when I worked in politics, there were conservative Democrats and there were liberal Republicans. The parties weren't totally homogenized. They have become homogenized, and they're very different. I mean, we lived in a different world then. Conservatives and liberals had different approaches to problem solving, but there was usually an agreement on what the problems were. Today, conservatives and liberals, the left and the right, live on different planets. I mean, if you look at polls, for example, you find that they don't even agree on what the problems are, let alone what the solutions are, because one of the downsides of modern technology is that you can just talk to people that agree with you. You can get your news from sources that already agree with you. And when you're engaging people that disagree with you, you think they're from another planet. And it's very difficult under those circumstances to come to the kinds of agreements you could come to. And another reason that Washington has changed since when we were active there years ago is that, frankly, back in the 70s and even into the 80s, Washington had always been a Democratic town since the Great Depression. And the Republicans, Bob Michel being a good example, in the days when the Democratic Party enjoyed...
Bob Michel was the Republican leader of the House before Newt Gingrich.
Right. In those days, the Democrats had a 2/3 majority. And if I was a Republican congressman and I wanted a bridge, for example, in my district, I'd go to Bob Michel. He'd play golf with Tip O'Neill and say, look, Dave needs a bridge. And Tip would say, well, we can give him a bridge because it's not going to hurt anything, because it's not going to endanger our majority. And then I'd get a bridge, but everybody'd be nice. And it was, Republicans like to describe it as, I mean, if you lived on the plantation, you knew what your role was. And it was, to the outsider, it was a very sort of congenial role. Then all of a sudden, things changed. And since then, partisan politics in Washington has become competitive. So you got in a situation where he couldn't give you that bridge because that might let you hold the seat. And if you had a 6-vote majority, you couldn't afford to let somebody do that. So just as in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, if you've got close competition, things get a lot tougher than they were before. In addition to that, as they were getting tougher, everything was changing so that even the Senate is not the collegial body that it was years ago. You're out doing other things. I noticed, if you read the Wall Street Journal today, there was a review of a book that Bob Mary wrote the review, analyzing presidential schedules, and they pointed out that if you looked at the schedules of presidents up to Kennedy, they all had a lot of time to think. They weren't scheduled 24 hours a day. And then all of a sudden that shifted in the 1960s, and so you had 15 meetings a day, and there was no time to really do anything. And he said that sort of eviscerated the presidency. It also eviscerated Congress and the Senate, so that the collegiality and the ability to get together and talk about things that existed to some extent doesn't exist because there's time to do it. So you had all these things come together, and now you've got a situation where people don't talk to each other. They don't even know each other. So there's not much that they can really talk about.
It is remarkable the extent to which they don't know each other. They arrive on Tuesday morning, they leave on Thursday evening. The airplane has revolutionized the personal relationships that people used to have, and it's no accident that it's senators who've been there a long time who have personal relationships across the aisle, and they're fewer and fewer. Do you think the rise of Newt Gingrich had something to do with this?
I think he was simply, the world was changing. And it's always easy to say, this guy did it, but this guy might also have been a product of the changes. Because outside Washington, Republicans and their views were gaining adherence. Inside Washington, they weren't acting or being treated that way. And so when he led that fight, when he toppled the old leadership, that was really a reflection of the change as opposed to the cause of the change. But you have very different personalities now than you did back in those days, and it's really difficult to deal with some of these folks because when you take Mitch McConnell and Harry Reid, when they were the leaders of the Senate, these were not guys that were used to sitting down and talking to each other. I'll tell a story that I have a very good friend who's I guess a moderate conservative senator, and I was having dinner with him during the time when Harry Reid was about to exercise the nuclear option, which was one of their big tactical mistakes.
So that means that you would have to get rid of the filibuster for everything except Supreme Court justices in terms of and for appointments.
So during dinner, he kept having to take these calls. And I said, well, what's this all about? And he said, the Senate is so dysfunctional. This is a Republican senator. He said, nobody talks to Harry Reid. Chuck Schumer and Dick Durbin won't talk to each other. McConnell won't talk to any of them. He said, I'm the go-between. I get these calls. I said, this is a great way to run a legislative body. But that's the kind of atmosphere that exists up there. today, and really in both parties.
Let me switch gears, and before we get to Trump and the current state of conservatism and the president and the Democrats, let's talk about the NRA. What led to you becoming president of the NRA?
I'd always been, I mean, I'm a Wisconsin boy. I grew up hunting and fishing. I'd been involved on gun issues when I worked in the Senate, when I worked at the White House during the Nixon years, and then they recruited me to go onto the board. It was happenstance in many ways that I was president of the NRA at the time that what we call the gunfight with the Obama administration took place, because you can't predict that. It was supposed to be a nice, pleasant sort of end of my career, and it turned out that it was a lot of work. It was the NRA is probably the single most effective grassroots lobbying organization in modern times. It now has 5 million members. There was I don't know if David Cole, who's a professor at Georgetown and has just taken a leave to become litigation director for the ACLU, wrote a book last year called Engines of Liberty. A third of it is about the gay marriage fight, a third of it is about Guantanamo prisoners, and the other third is about the NRA. And when it comes to gun owners and hunters, he ended that section by saying that gun owners in America have to realize that their main line of defense is not the Constitution or the Supreme Court or the Congress, it's the National Rifle Association. And that's really been true since the early 1970s. The NRA was formed after the Civil War by Union generals who thought that the Civil War had lasted about 2 years too long because Northern soldiers had no firearms training and couldn't compete with their Southern antagonists. The saying at the time was that a Confederate infantryman was as valuable as 3 Union infantrymen. But the problem was that the Union had 5 for every one. So after the war, they decided, and the reason for that was that the Union in the Civil War was recruiting from the newly industrializing cities of the Northeast for European immigrants who came from countries where there was no firearms tradition. Many Union soldiers never fired a gun until they got into battle, and that's not the place where you want to try to learn how to use a gun. So 2 of the first presidents of the NRA were Ulysses S. Grant and Phil Sheridan, Union generals during the war. From that date, in 1871 until the 1970s, the NRA wasn't a political organization at all. We didn't have a political arm. There was no lobbyist. Didn't endorse candidates. Was involved in firearms training and technical information. We ran and trained Olympic shooters and the like. It wasn't until the so-called culture wars of the 60s broke out that eventually, and the atmosphere at that time was 1968, Lyndon Johnson had passed what was called the Gun Control Act of 1968, which was the most anti-firearms piece of legislation ever passed. After he lost
What did it do?
Well, a lot in terms of license holders, gunsmiths, sale of guns, all kinds of things, transportation of firearms, and there was a whole spate of prosecutions after that. For example, you had requirement that it was illegal to be a dealer without being registered, but they didn't define dealer. So the prosecutions were generally about gun collectors who sold more than one gun in a year because they went and traded guns and all that. Grandfathers were prosecuted for giving their kids or their grandchildren firearms at Christmas. All those things took place in that period. Finally, Birch Bayh, a Democratic senator from Indiana, had 3 weeks of hearing and tried to straighten out some of that. But the atmosphere is the important thing, because 2 years later, Richard Nixon's Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, convened a commission and then endorsed the findings that all handguns should be confiscated within 10 years and that no handgun should be allowed to be manufactured or sold in the United States. That was the atmosphere in the 1960s, at the late 1960s. At that point, John Dingell, congressman from Michigan, who actually only retired a couple of years ago.
He succeeded his father in the 1930s.
Right.
His father had been there for
Now
a
his
long
wife
time,
has the job.
and now his wife has the job, and pretty soon I think his son
Right.
will be the next person in line.
And who said that we're not a democracy? At any rate, John Dingell came to the NRA and said, you can train all the people you want in safe handling of firearms. You can run all the competition you want. You can do all of these things. None of it's going to matter because in 10 years there aren't going to be any guns in this country unless you people step up to the plate. So there was a revolution in the NRA, and what we now call the new NRA was formed. And from that point on, NRA members have been very involved in the political sphere. So, and that has said everything. I was in the Nixon White House, and this is what politicians often misread polls. That you never notice that. But this was when the Firearms Act, of 1968, the major sponsor was Joe Tidings of Maryland, which even then was what we would today call a blue state. He was running for re-election, and he read a poll that said that on gun control, people supported the position. So he said, why should I be running from this? Who are these people? Who are these NRA people? Who are these gun owners that are complaining? So he ran ads bragging about the fact that he was the guy that got this legislation through. And I remember we didn't have all this fancy technological stuff in those days, but we were sitting around in the White House on Election Day, and somebody said, what's going on in Maryland? And somebody else said, well, let's call one of our guys there and find out. So we called, and the fellow said, I don't know what's going on, but I'll tell you this, there are long lines of pickup trucks at every polling place outside Baltimore City, and they all have gun racks in the back, which they had in those days. And Tidings lost big time, and that was the first major politician to go down as the politics of firearms changed in this country.
Let me see if we can talk a little bit about the substance of it.
Sure.
The NRA often accuses candidates, especially Democratic candidates, of wanting, in effect, to destroy the Second Amendment.
Right.
Is that literally true in your mind?
Well, it certainly would have been true. It was literally true and most explicitly stated in this last presidential election, because the key Supreme Court case, which finally codified the meaning of the Second Amendment as guaranteeing the right of an individual to own a firearm in his home for self-protection, was Heller versus the District of Columbia. Mrs. Clinton, and there was only one legal question before the court in that case, and that was, does the Second Amendment guarantee the right of an individual citizen to own a firearm? Mrs. Clinton said, no, it does not. That was the question. That case was wrongly decided. The government had argued that was not the case, and that if firearms were to be allowed, that was a matter of policy, not a matter of constitutional right. The Supreme Court found it was a matter of constitutional right. And I can tell you that your friend back in the 1970s, Senator Kennedy, in referring to the Gun Control Act, said that was a great first step, but what we need to do is ban firearms in this country. So there's no question that there are a lot of people who would do that, and the NRA is obviously opposed to those people. And it's a little bit like it's sort of a quasi-religion. In the foreword to my book, John Bolton compares it to the unilateral disarmament movement in the 70s and in the 60s. There are people who believe in a sort of quasi-religious way that if you could snap your fingers and there'd be no more firearms, that everything would be fine. That we live in a utopia, there wouldn't be robberies, there wouldn't be home break-ins, there wouldn't be all these things, there wouldn't be crime. That's not the case, and we know that now. The empirical evidence supports the positions that the NRA takes substantively on, for example, concealed carry. But if you think of the impact, in 1980, 3 states allowed some form of concealed carry. By 2017, 50 states.
Why is that good?
It's good because what's happened, one, it's a question of their constitutional rights. Secondly, and this is one of the reasons that in recent years, most of the growth in the NRA has been among women who joined for self-defense purposes. It's also, from a policy standpoint, it's been very good because in every place where concealed carry has been legalized, you've had a drop in violent crime. It's not all because of concealed carry. That would be ridiculous. But in each of these arguments, it's been argued by the other side that if you allow concealed carry, you're going to have gunfights at stop signs, all of these different things. None of that's happened, and empirically it's gone down, and there's a reason for that. The first of the model concealed carry law was adopted in Florida. And after that happened, there was a spate of robberies of people arriving at Miami International Airport and driving rental cars. I'm not making this up. It became a hunting preserve for criminals. Eventually, because they knew that if you came in on an airplane, you didn't have a gun. And if you were in a rental car coming out of the airport, that meant that you'd come in on an airplane. And those were the people they were targeting. Not because everybody had a firearm, but the concealed carry law meant that if 1 in 10 did, and you were a thug, you didn't know who it was. So did it eliminate crime? No. But it made them more careful. Eventually, the rental car companies had to take the stickers and things that they had on the cars off, so that they wouldn't be setting arriving passengers up as potential victims of violent crime. And the empirical evidence is fairly clear that makes a difference. It's a little bit like having a Rottweiler in your yard.
I want to come back to Hillary Clinton and Democrats in a moment, but it's not just concealed carry at this point. It's also people saying we should have open carry of guns. And do you think that we should, and that should apply even to churches and schools?
No, I think this is my personal view. There are three kinds of laws involving the carrying of firearms. The one is, most of the states now have what you call shall issue laws, and that means that if I want to carry a firearm concealed, you have to go through a course in that, but if you pass the background checks and everything, then they shall issue the permit. Other states, particularly Maryland, New York, California, have what they call may issue laws, which means it's up to the politician, up to the sheriff or the government to decide. In Maryland, you're supposed to be able to prove that your life is in imminent danger to the satisfaction of the police before they'll give you that. What it really means is that you can get one if you know the sheriff, but you can't get one if you don't. Then there are 11 states that have what they call constitutional concealed carry, that would be Vermont, Arizona, Missouri, some others, where they say that if you pass all the background checks, there's no need for you to go through all this. They just issue you on your request a license that you've done all that. Then there's the question of open carry, which has been legal in most states, not all states, but forever. Most people aren't interested in carrying a firearm openly. I always tell people that get involved in legal cases that they ought to be careful what they ask for, because the Ninth Circuit, in a challenge to a concealed carry law, issued a decision last year where they said it is okay to ban concealed carry. That's in dispute, and will eventually be decided in the Supreme Court. But they said it's unarguably you can't ban open carry, because that has always been part of the in the old days, that's what you did. The Second Amendment says you have a right not just to keep, but to bear arms. And I said, from a policy standpoint, open carry doesn't accomplish what concealed carry accomplishes. You know, if I've got a gun openly and you don't, the guy knows which one of us to take. If it's a concealed, so just from a policy standpoint, it's also rude, frankly, to be. A lot of people are offended by firearms, and why would you do that? So it's not so much a question of what's right or what's constitutional. The argument in the court was that in the 18th century, oftentimes concealed firearms were banned because the only people that would conceal them would be criminals. And open firearms were legal because everybody had that right. I think from a policy standpoint in modern society, concealed carry is a much better option.
Churches, schools, college campuses, would you favor concealed carry?
In Colorado, where the theater shooting took place in Aurora some years ago. In Colorado, under the state laws, if a public building posts itself as a gun-free zone, then the state has an obligation to those going there to make sure that criminals don't carry guns there. So they have, and one of the problems in that theater was that it was private property and they just posted gun-free zone. So everybody complied with that because they were thinking of public buildings, and that's where the shooter went. And in Colorado, statistically, if they had not posted that sign, given the size of the audience, there would have been 5 or 6 people in that theater who were armed when that guy got up on the stage and started shooting people. But
So you would have had a gun battle in the theater?
well, it wouldn't have been. We've had a number of places where this has happened, and it hasn't been gun battles. It's been take them out.
Talk about it.
There have been numerous places in malls, schools, and the like where there is an armed security guard, or there is a citizen who's there. And usually these citizens are trained. Sometimes they've come to the aid of a police officer. Sometimes they've been the only people on the scene, and they have either stopped or mitigated the damage that might have been done. For example, when you had the Orlando shooting in the gay nightclub, there was nobody there. And the president said, well, it's a good thing there wasn't anybody there because it could have been worse. The next week at another nightclub, the same things started to happen, and there was somebody in the line who was armed, and he took the guy out right away. So you don't hear about that one.
Is there any basis for compromise here? I mean, I listened to you earlier talk about Hillary Clinton and the Heller case. But in fact, what she favored, as I understand it, were tougher background checks and closing the gun show loophole, or so-called loophole, you probably want to say, which can let criminals or the mentally disturbed avoid background checks.
Well, they don't. No, that's not true. In fact, who
can go to a gun show and buy a gun?
Who can go to a gun show?
Can anybody go to a gun show and buy a gun?
If you about 97% of the guns sold at a gun show, any gun show, are sold by dealers, and those dealers have to do a background check.
But what about the non-dealers?
The non-dealers, if you're selling a firearm to me, you're not allowed legally to sell to anyone who you have any reason to believe is in a prohibited category. What happens at most gun shows, for example, in Virginia, where there are a lot of them, the state police have a table, and for $5 they'll do a check. You know, most of the private sales go to that table unless it's somebody that they know. So the number of people who actually purchase a firearm privately with no background check is very small. The problem has always been that the so-called gun show loophole, which we had a debate in the Senate a few years ago when Senator Lautenberg was alive, in which he claimed the NRA was facilitating the sale of machine guns to terrorists. We had to have a special federal law to stop that. And we didn't do the research at the NRA. Some reporter, there are still reporters who do this. Machine guns are illegal in this country except under very stringent circumstances. They haven't been manufactured since 1968. And to buy one is $100,000, roughly, because of the rarity and the licenses you need to go through, and they're not sold at gun shows. So this reporter did this, and since the 1930s, there have actually been 2 people in this country who've been killed by machine guns. One was shot by a police officer, and the other one was shot by a gun collector. And as the reporter said, certainly since 1939 until today, that would be justification for a full day's debate in the United States Senate about something that doesn't take place and can't take place. So a lot of this, let me tell you, when you remember the Sperling breakfast in Washington? This was for years an institution, still exists. It's the Christian Science Monitor breakfast now because Bud Sperling is gone. But it's they'll invite somebody, a policy guy or somebody that knows, or a politician. I'm sure you've been there. And they have maybe 50 reporters. And I was invited to one during this whole thing. And so I said, the question came up about the so-called gun show loophole. And I was explaining this, and I said, well, just a minute. How many people at this table have ever been to a gun show? Not one hand went up. So I said, it happens that the largest gun show in the D.C. metropolitan area will be taking place next Saturday. And so I'll tell you what, the monitor will pass a paper around, and by Wednesday, if you sign up, I'll take you there. And you can see what it is you're writing about. And then if you want, we'll go over to the NRA, and you can ask any questions you want. The poor fellow from the Christian Science Monitor called me on Wednesday and said, I don't know how to tell you this, but nobody signed up. Nobody was interested because they're writing, it's like much of Washington today. They're writing their opinions and they don't want to be bothered.
So
can there be, you're back to your question. A few years ago, and I sat down with a group called the Prosecutors Against Gun Violence, which is chaired by Cy Vance, who's the district attorney in New York, and I forget the guy's name out here in Los Angeles. I'm an East Coast guy, but about 150 prosecutors, and we talked about various things, and where is there areas of cooperation? For example, they said, are there instances where you believe, for example, in a psychological break, where you could justify suspending somebody's Second Amendment rights temporarily? And I said, not only that, we have done that. Colorado passed its concealed carry law. The NRA supported something that came to be known as the Naked Man Amendment. Our position on depriving somebody of a fundamental right is that there has to be due process. In Colorado, though, the Naked Man Amendment was that named that way because hypothetically, if there's the permits are issued by the sheriff in most states because the sheriff is supposed to be more closer to the people and cognizant of all these things. So it was if there's a guy sitting naked on the courthouse lawn with a tinfoil hat who asked for a gun permit, and there's been no due process and no adjudication, it might be rational on the part of the sheriff to say, no, you can't have it. We're going to have to look into this. And then it went in. So we passed an amendment so that they giving the sheriff the right to stop that without due process, and then within 48 hours it'd have to go to a board. I said that's logical and it's individual. The way we look at it is you cannot and should not be treating people as members of groups. One of the proposals that came up then was the people from Mayor Bloomberg's group suggested that we should have a 10-year ban on the Second Amendment rights of anybody arrested for DWI. I said, you have empirical evidence that if you have one too many beers, you're going to shoot up a school? There's no evidence. That's just an attempt to deny firearms rights to another group of people. And I don't believe that. We don't believe that. One of the problems in this country, we have a lot of problems in the country, but one of the parts of the American character over historical period has been one, we overreact to things. We talked about the mental health care system. We decided that there were abuses in the mental health care system, so we were going to abolish it and replace it. We abolished it. We didn't replace it. So that I spend about a third of my time not on these issues, but on criminal justice reform issues. And in every single state in this country, in the jails and prisons, there are more people who've been found to be dangerously mentally ill than there are in all the treatment facilities in that state. Not just one place, everywhere. And a lot of the people that get out, these are the victims, they're also the perpetrators in many instances. We don't do anything about that. But the other problem is that we've always tried, for I think specious reasons and contrary to our traditions, to try to predict who criminals are going to be. Poor people, black people. In the 70s, we had a spate of interest in the criminal chromosome. Do you remember that? The XYY chromosome, which said we should track kids, we should test people. And if they've got that chromosome, they're likely to become criminals. And there were actually physical characteristics that go with it, freckles and red hair. So I said, there go the Irish, and we're taking care of the poor and the blacks and the Irish. And now people that get picked up for DWI, people that are this is not a country where we deny rights or we punish people because of their membership in a group. So what we demand is in all of these cases is adjudication and individual treatment.
I'm sure we'll get questions about gun rights and guns from the audience. And I do have to note, you just mentioned your work on prison reform. You spent a lot of time on that. You spent a lot of time, you were opposed to the Patriot Act. So.
Well, that's not, I wasn't opposed to the Patriot Act, I was opposed to much of the Patriot Act.
Okay, much of the Patriot Act. So I want to move on from this to Trump and then turn this over to the audience. What do you think of Donald Trump?
I think the jury's out. He was not my first choice for president. I was Scott Walker fan. But when it came down from the purely political side, and there were a lot of reasons why conservatives had problems with Donald Trump, his background. He was not a consistent conservative, or possibly even a Republican for most of his career. His manner had serious problems with him on some issues, particularly trade issues and the like. But from a political standpoint, when it came down to two things, one was it was a choice on the Republican side between him and Ted Cruz, which is what it came down to. My feeling at the time was that Cruz couldn't win, and that while Trump was a dangerous candidate in the sense that he had no experience and tended to say things without a filter, that he had an upside because I think that what he was speaking to, if it wasn't Donald Trump, was going to be somebody else at some point, because we have left a significant part of this country voiceless, and now we've tended to dismiss them. And he embraced all that and got it. So I thought he had a chance to win. I was right on that grounds. The NRA supported him early when it became obvious because he committed to appointing a Supreme Court justice that would be in the mold of Antonin Scalia. He did that. Since being elected, it's clear that as a novice president, he's not yet figured out how to deal with Congress. I don't think that there's a great understanding of it. There are a lot of shakeouts going on in the White House, and that's louder than it gets, more public than it usually is, but it's not unusual at the beginning of an administration. From the cabinet standpoint, I think he's done a pretty good job. I think it's a pretty decent cabinet. Obviously, from the NRA standpoint, we're very happy with the Interior Secretary and what they're doing there. He's got a lot of capable people that are in there. Whether he's going to be successful or not is yet to be seen. I think, though, the troubling part is that this sort of refusal to accept the results of an election. And I mean, we've elected presidents that I didn't like, but I've never gone out and said what we can do. We should do anything that we can to destroy that president, to get him out of office. So I think that's a real problem. It's going to be an interesting few years because it's what he is doing, whether he's doing it in a well thought out way or not, is he's challenging. He's doing what he said he would do, which was to challenge the establishment in this country.
In both parties.
In both parties. I don't like. I'm not one who uses this language, but I have to say that I had to apologize a little bit to a reporter after the election because my wife had told me, and from June on, that there was no question that Trump was going to be elected. I wasn't so sure of that. But I apologize because I said in many ways I am what should be counted as a Trump voter. I'm the only member of my family that ever went to college and graduated. My father spent his life as a union organizer and a bartender. My mother was the 5-term president of the International Auxiliary of the United Auto Workers, which was not a right-wing group. I have a brother who's an auto worker, a brother who's a cop, and most of the people that I went to school with in high school didn't go to college. And when I went to Wisconsin in the early fall, I drove down there. These people were angry, and that should have been a clue. And then I drove down a street in a small town, and on both sides of the street, on every lawn, was a sign that said "proudly deplorable." That should have been the second clue. And what happened is, and I think that part of the reason for the Trump victory was that there was an assumption, a political assumption from the analysts for the last 10 years, that all of the white working and middle class voters who were going to leave the Democrats left in the Reagan and Nixon years, and that you could ignore the rest of them. And I did write a year or so ago, what if they're wrong? What if 2% more of these people leave? But they were so convinced that was true that Mrs. Clinton never went to those states. And if you went back over time, and looked, and I haven't done this, so this is partly speculation because I can't give you an exact number, but I did go back and look at some of Obama's appearances and her appearances over the 2 years before the election. When they went to Wisconsin, they went to Madison. When they went to Michigan, they went to Ann Arbor. I mean, they went to college and university towns, and if you do that in the Midwest, you can visit each of the states without ever visiting the state.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, and I want to turn this over to the audience, that there were places, and you probably are much more familiar with it than I am, and may even explain how it got its name. There's a county in Wisconsin called Pepin County, name, same spelling as Charlemagne's father, so I've never understood how it got that name. It voted Democratic in every election since 1972, and McGovern almost carried it. It voted Democratic in the Reagan landslide of 1984. It voted by 24 points for Donald Trump. It was a county that had been carried twice by Barack Obama. I think there probably was no, I don't think, I am certain that Hillary Clinton never connected with an economic message with voters who felt dispossessed and in trouble, in contrast to Obama, who talked about saving the auto industry.
And it was, you know, here's what happened. I mean, how many of you have ever seen American Graffiti, the movie?
Only the old people.
Oh my God. Oh my Lord. Well, I grew up in Rockford, Illinois, before I moved to Wisconsin, before my family moved to Wisconsin. Rockford, Illinois was the machine tool capital of the United States, along with Cincinnati, Ohio. I grew up in the 50s, and most of the people that were there then working in the machine tool industry were Hungarians. They had come from the Hungarian Revolution. And even at that time, I thought, you know, one of the things we have not done in this country is we haven't trained our own people to run factories. We've been lucky because we had Nazis and communists, and whenever we needed people, one of those two groups would drive people out of some country that had some, and they're the people who manned our factories, who ran them. And then all of a sudden the 1990s arrived. No more communists, no more Nazis, no more trained people. So I use American Graffiti because that took place in the early 60s. And those of you who saw the movie remember that it was as they were leaving high school and they were going to go to college, but one poor schmuck wasn't going to go. He was left behind. Well, when I graduated from high school in 1961, there was one guy, but it was different because the attitudes hadn't changed. American Graffiti was made much later than that, when the attitudes had changed in the elites. He wasn't going to go, and he said, you guys go to college if you want to. I'm going to open a heating and air conditioning business, and I'm going to get rich. And he did. But by 1980, he wouldn't have done that because there was this cultural sense that if you didn't go to college and you didn't get a college degree, you were a failure. And that would have been beat into his head. It was beat into his head. Those people who left the Democratic Party in the Midwest, in Pepin County, they left because the Democrats in the 60s through the 80s were culturally obnoxious. The Republicans didn't do anything for them. They accepted their votes, and by the 90s and by 2000, by 2015, they were now hurting economically, and neither party was doing anything. But what was worse was they were then told that they were part of the past and they didn't come. And with Mrs. Clinton, I don't mean this pejoratively, but what they used to say about the communists was, you know, they loved the working class. It was workers that they hated. And Mrs. Clinton may have said she identifies with working Americans and middle class, but she wasn't much interested in understanding them or doing much about them. And they were angry, and they want something done about it. And the Republicans weren't either. As I say, they banked on their cultural antipathy to the way the Democrats were going for their loyalty. That is no longer enough. So what Trump has now, or what the Republicans have, is an opportunity to do something for them. And if they can't do that, we're in for political volatility.
Or if they do the opposite,
sure.
Which is basically help people at the top.
I hate to say this at a college, a university, because I went to one too, but I said, you know, what they ought to do is knock Princeton off the pedestal and put a trade school up there. Because there was a Harvard study recently that in the Midwest, in some of these areas where you're taxing people and then they're taking the best people out of those areas, brightest people, sending them to a university, giving them a scholarship, and training them to do something that can't be done back home. It's like giving an NBA scholarship to somebody in a public housing development. It doesn't improve anything except that person's future. And what's needed out there are jobs and training for real jobs. And if both parties would get together and do that, we could do it. But neither party is really doing that.
So we have about 15 minutes left. I want to open this up to the audience. Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Cain. Thank you for being here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. He's just. So I have a question regarding a piece of controversial policy. I'm reading from the LA Times. In 2007, the Bush administration urged passage of a law giving the government authority to block suspected terrorists from buying guns, but Congress rejected Bush's sensible terror gap proposal, bowing to the National Rifle Association. So I just kind of wanted to know the rationale behind that decision, the no-fly zone, or the no-fly.
Actually, that proposal's been made several times. Dianne Feinstein has made it. The FBI testified against doing it because right now, you've got all of these various terrorist watch lists and no-fly lists. There are like 1 million people on these various things. Some of them are actual terrorists, but as a friend of mine who was head of the Commission on Terrorism said, if there are 1 million of them, we might as well just strike the flag now. But with the FBI's, what happens now is if you go to Walmart to buy a firearm, which is the biggest firearm dealer in America is Walmart, you go through a background check. That background check includes all of those people. And if you're on one of those lists, that's flagged and it's immediately shifted over to the FBI. And then the FBI inquires to the person who put it on the list, because any bureaucrat can do that, what's your reason? 99% of them, there's no reason, so they say that's fine. The other 1%, the FBI says, don't deny them a gun, because if we're tracking a terrorist and he walks into a Walmart and is denied a gun because he's on one of those lists, then he knows. So the law enforcement doesn't want that, because they get that information immediately when the background check is run. They don't want automatically to start doing that, because then they can't track the terrorists. That's a tip-off to the terrorist, supposed terrorists. So that's the reason. Then the FBI director testified against that.
Another question? Sure.
Thanks, Mr. Cain. So you alluded to it a little bit earlier, and it seems like you alluded to it a little earlier. It seems like there's this, giant chasm between right and left politically now, and statistically that bears out with congressional analysis. But I'm curious, it seems there are some issues. So take the retention of public lands, or rather the opposition against divesting public lands, where under different names, conservationism on the right, environmentalism on the left, you see Smith & Wesson and Ruger on the same side of a political issue as Patagonia and REI, which is not always typical. I'm curious what you would see, if any, as the path to kind of towards the middle with other issues. So for instance, firearms regulation in California, which has been not only notoriously strict, but also prohibiting certain features that don't necessarily change the lethality of a firearm or statistically its use in a crime. So I'm curious on issues like that, where it seems there's still a wide divide. Is there any way to co-opt other trends to get somewhere to the middle politically?
Well, it's largely a matter of education and getting at the people in the middle, because what you have are people that aren't listening to each other and haven't listened to each other. The governor here just had I don't know if he signed it, to deny those school districts that could opt to have armed security if they desired it, to take that away from them, including teachers who were under, women teachers who had orders against abusive husbands and the rest, that they couldn't have a firearm. I'm the head in the NRA of what we call the National School Shield Program, which we set up after Sandy Hook, and we provide basically training and funds mostly to police departments so that they can go in and assess schools. When Sandy Hook took place and the NRA suggested that we ought to look at security for the schools, the first thing the White House said that was crazy. Then they realized that most urban schools already have armed security. And that's not where these things take place. They take place where they don't, and where they don't have much money. So if a school wants to go, we had Asa Hutchinson, who had been number 2 at Homeland Security, had been a U.S. attorney, a congressman, and the head of the DEA, and is now governor of Arkansas, take a year to look at what the best kinds of things we could do to enhance school security were. And one of the first ones is to provide assessments of what a school needs. Rarely does it involve firearms. Sometimes it does. Some schools want firearms, some schools don't, but it can be locks. There are all kinds of things. It's like a 2-day assessment. Well, a school that has to go out on the open market has to pay $10,000 to $15,000 just for that. So what we've done is we've now trained 200 or 300 people around the country in law enforcement agencies to do that for free, so that a school in their jurisdictions, these are usually sheriff's departments or local police, they'll have somebody on staff who's an expert at assessment, so they can go in and tell the school what they need, then they can do the thing. But to make a one-size-fits-all, either thing is crazy. I went to, spoke to a group of 800 Orthodox Jewish school administrators in Florida last fall. They face a different kind of problem. Just putting a police presence or an armed security presence or any kind of security presence in most schools will prevent the kind of people from going into the school and shooting it up that we've had in these places. These aren't warriors, these are people who want to kill, and just it's the mere presence, they'll go somewhere else. That's not true of the kind of people that might shoot up an Orthodox Jewish school. And those schools get most of the money from Homeland Security for school security. They all want armed people because they say the kind of people that are liable to attack our school are warriors. They're not just killers, they're warriors. And so you have to fight back against them. So the position we took and the position you have to take on all of these things is look at the individual circumstance and do it. You know, Americans are incredibly inventive people because when we went out and assessed schools, one school that we found had moving on its own, had what you might call the air marshal model, where they had trained several people in the school administration, teachers, a janitor, the other 7 people in the school that knew how to handle a firearm. This is more than concealed carry, but it's a lot more training than that. But on any given day, only one was armed, but nobody knew who that was. That's sort of the air marshal. One other jurisdiction, this was my favorite one because I'm cheap. They said, well, if the police presence in the school helps keep these people away, 40% of the cops' time is filling out reports. So the city issued a thing that they could no longer fill out their reports at police stations. They had to do it in schools. So that all we had to do was move desks into the public areas in the schools, and we had cops there all the time that were doing their work. It didn't cost anybody anything. I mean, Americans figure out how to do these things. There are a lot of this whole area of the public lands. You know, the reason that if you're a Westerner, because of the way that the feds sort of bully you, you're in favor of the state control of a lot of the federal lands. I was in, I don't want to be too long-winded about this, but I was in Montana and Wyoming last year, and there was a virus that got into the Yellowstone River. Within hours, the state of Montana closed 160 miles of rivers, and then the Park Service said, well, it's the anniversary of Yellowstone, so we're not going to close that. And I asked the head of the DNR in Wyoming, I said, does that make any sense? Is the virus going to stop at the border of the national park because they don't want to end their celebration? And he said, welcome to our world where the federal government tells us what to do whenever they want, in whatever manner they want, and never bothers to even consult or inform us. That's the Western attitude. Congressman Zinke was against the states controlling the lands, and so was Donald Trump. So that's how Zinke became Secretary of the Interior. He was a Westerner who did not favor turning title over, but he believes in access and all of those things. So it seems to be working out pretty well, and a lot of these different groups are coming together. That happens in a lot of areas. You know, when we sit and talk about how nobody can get along and how and that's true and it's untrue. I mean, as Bob knows in Washington, on things that are lower on the visibility scale, that are not out there all the time, people do get along and do get things done. But whether it's the competition, whether it's the way we get our news, whether it's the poisonous atmosphere that exists. It's very hard on a lot of things to get any kind of cooperation. And that doesn't mean agreement. I mean, you can sit down with people you don't agree with on fundamental issues, and you can still work out 70% of your problems. But you have to sit down, and you have to be able to listen. You have to be able to talk across the table, and that has to be reestablished, because that's not taking place very much in our society.
Okay, we got time for a couple quick questions. I have to do one over here, and then I'll come back over here. Yeah.
I'd like to ask about, am I being heard?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to ask about the value of firearms and protecting oneself in daily modern situations as we know them in cities and not in rural areas. Let's imagine, because we're on a college campus, that it's somebody young and able-bodied of these ages, and they're doing their normal daily stuff, their normal tasks, walking home from university, or loading groceries into a car, or walking their dog and bending over to pick up dog shit. The nature, and let's say that they're armed. They've learned how to use their weapon properly. They go to the shooting range every once in a while and renew their skill set. The nature of armed robbery is that the thief or the robber is always alert, and the first step, the initiation, comes from the person that's doing the robbery. So if you're armed and you're carrying, often these students are on Tinder as they walk, or they're on Instagram. They're not looking around.
I understand. So the question is,
I'm setting it up.
but can you set it up and get to it?
I'm getting to it. They're not alert. Nobody today walks in a state of alertness. The thief is alert. So you have your weapon, you're trained, but you have your weapon in your tote bag, you have your weapon in your backpack. What do you think the chances are when the armed robber makes his first step that the person defending themselves will have success?
It's estimated that between 200,000 and 1 million times a year, a crime is stopped as a result of an armed civilian. That doesn't mean everybody gets shot, because that's not the case. But, obviously, individual circumstances, if the guy's got the drop on, if you're well trained, then you're not going to be able to get your gun out. But, criminals aren't rocket scientists either. And the fact is that there are thousands of examples. I get a thing every single day of news summaries of places in which firearms have been used to stop criminals. In today's world, most of those are home invasions. And you're not taken by surprise when they're starting to break into your house.
Okay.
Are there circumstances where it won't work? Of course. But there are many more circumstances where it will.
Two people have had their hands up a long time. We're only going to get to one of them. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm one of the older ones here. I've been out of college more decades than some of you have been alive. But I am extremely appreciative. I hope you truly understand these realistic discussions about the real world. I want to thank you, Bob. I don't know you, for arranging this. And I want to thank you, David, for coming, but I don't know you. But the one thing that you have not really expanded upon, and I would hope you do in future, is the role the media plays in the division that young man was talking about. I'm a member of the media. I started as a journalist and created a radio program, news programs heard around the world. But for the last 40 years, I've been a director and producer in Hollywood. And I wrote a book on media and how perception is reality in media, and how the media portrays reality becomes your perception. And that is the thing that has driven this. Everything you said was absolutely correct about the politics of Republicans and Democrats and the different administrations, except in my humble opinion, as a member of the media, during the first campaign of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, there was, I think around Michigan, there was a shift. The media went for Barack Obama instead of Hillary Clinton. And from that point forward, as a member of the working media, reporting ceased and propagandizing began. And that's what you have today. And I would welcome an opportunity if you could do another one of these. But I just want to tell you, you don't know me from Adam, but the fact is, this is probably the most important bit of information and in your education you're going to get in the next 6 months.
Thank you. Quick question, quick answer.
Dream
Thank you for coming. My question is, why do you think you've been so successful in protecting the gun rights for guns that are seemingly obsolete or unnecessary for the purposes you claim, namely hunting, protection, and the right to form a militia?
Why have we been successful?
Yeah, and I'm talking about semi-automatic weapons.
Well, the semi-automatic weapons, what the anti-gun people like to call automatic weapons, aren't automatic weapons, as you know. In the Heller decision, you know, and they're really talking about the AR-15 and they like to call assault weapons. These are the most popular guns in the United States. They're owned by 5.5, 6 million people. They're used in competition more than any other firearm. In the 90s, if you'll recall, when Bill Clinton's administration banned them for 10 years, they did that, or were able to do that, because nobody had any. Statistically, nobody owned AR-15s then. I mean, sure, some people did, but not very many. When, after Sandy Hook, when Dianne Feinstein wanted to do it again, the leadership said, no, we're not even going to bring that up, because 5 million people now have those kinds of firearms and use them. And the Supreme Court said that's just the kind of gun that you can't ban, one that's legally used and widely owned. So that's why the specific firearm is. So, you know, this is too long, but we have at our museum a gun that went with Lewis and Clark in 1806, the Lewis and Clark expedition. It is a air gun, and we dug it up and found it. It was lost for a long time, and we test fired it. It's an air gun made in Belgium, and it'll fire 20, 50 caliber balls as fast as you can pull the trigger. It would have been illegal under the Feinstein bill. So the semi-automatic weapon has existed for longer than I knew it existed. And it's really the firearm, not just the AR-15, but shotguns and the like, have been very popular in this country for 100 years.
Okay, we have to wind up. I want to thank the audience for coming. I want to thank David for taking some time and doing this. And you know, it says on Twitter, retweets do not constitute endorsements. My thanks to David do not constitute an endorsement of everything he said. But it was great to have him here, and it's great that on this campus we can listen to people of widely different views. We can have strong opinions, and we model in some ways what should be civil dialogue. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you soon.